Salam Sejahtera and welcome to the brief on Bernama. I'm Nadia Abdul Latif. Now today, Friday, October the 29th, the 2022 budget will be tabled in the lower house of Parliament, Malaysia. Today, I'm privileged to be discussing the topic with three leaders. First, Datuk KUMARAJAH, Advisor, Doctor on Call, Secretary General of MAICCI, Malaysia Associated Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Dr. O.E. Sun, Political Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs and Principal Advisor of the Pacific Research Centre of Malaysia. And of course, our Crisis Analyst colleague and founder of Crisis Management Centre, Nordin Abdullah. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now jumping straight into it, let's look at the discussion in three key themes. We know that this is coming 4 p.m., the wakening hour of when we're going to be listening more about what the budget holds for Malaysia. Now, I want to focus on three main themes today. Number one, priorities for spending. Number two, the Rakyat, B40, M40, B50, the underserved. And third, of course, enterprise, MSMEs, and the way forward for survival and sustainability for businesses in Malaysia. Now, gentlemen, we know that due to COVID-19, last year's budget of 2021 hit a high. Now, this was as high as about 322.54 billion ringgit, with a budgetary deficit of approximately 6% of the country's GDP. In 2021, the budget had four broad themes, which was caring for the people, steering the economy, sustainable living, and enhancing public service delivery. Now, yesterday, the Bernama quoted Prime Minister Datuk Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob and saying that the 2022 budget was from the people, by the people, for the people, and would support high impact encompassing aid for the B40 and M40 groups, support for businesses to ensure that micro, small and medium or MSME sized enterprises have access to funding and activate business. But really, how far will the hopes and the aspirations of Malaysians be met this year as we try to rise out from the pandemic? I think that remains to be seen. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. O. Let's talk about priorities for expenditures. I mean, there are high hopes here, but we're more strapped than we ever were before. In juggling what needs to come first, is it MSME? Is it infrastructure? Is it B40? What are your thoughts? And which one first? Why?
Well, of course, any money that is spent by the government hopefully will have a stimulating effect on the economy, right? And in order to do that, I think, for example, the SMEs would have to be assisted. If not outright grants, you should at least cut some of their many taxes such that these SMEs could continue to provide jobs for our people, because SMEs, they do provide the most number of jobs usually. If they could not function well, a lot of jobs would be lost, and thereby you would have an expansion of the B40 groups. So the number one, to assist the SMEs such that you could indirectly also assist people to keep their jobs. And number two, I think some of these larger industries, they are also hard hit because their factories, for example, could not open for quite some time. Again, if you cannot give outright grants, then cut some of the taxes. Yeah.
Okay, so basically you're talking about let's restore back dignity, and in a way that goes beyond just handouts. If we can give people employment with dignity, make sure that people stay in jobs, that would be your preferred plan of action. Okay, Dato', I want to know what you think about this.
I think I kind of concur with what Dr. O says, but I think, Nadia, government must recalibrate some of the things that they've actually learned during the 20 months of COVID, right? So yes, all those 8 economic stimulus packages, I think it's a misnomer to even call it stimulus packages, because they were more rescue packages.
Yes.
As we speak, because they were only trying to make sure that jobs were not lost or businesses were not closed. Despite the best effort, which I think is very commendable, we still have about 30% of our MSMEs and SMEs nearly shutting down permanent, right?
Yeah.
And we still have a 4.6% joblessness rates in the country, which is about 800,000 people, and another 2.5 million people underemployed. in a situation like that, especially when looking at 2021, hoping for a recovery, which didn't happen, probably happening now in the third or fourth quarter, we must look at 2022 as the first year, first full year where many of these SMEs will be able to recover and go from a cash crunch position to a more cash positive position. And in that situation, what government should do is to just assist that transition while still mitigating the fact that a lot of regulatory impediments were there. And so some of this should be parked in a way. No increases should happen. No new taxes should be imposed. While I'm one of them who actually professes that we bring back value-added taxes and GST in some form or the manner. But I suppose not for the next year. Because next year, we must keep things simple, lean, making sure that the MSMEs are able to pivot on to the new business models and actually recover what they have lost for the last 20 months. In that way, government should make ease of financing. You know, that's the biggest problem. So if you look at all the reports that are coming out from Laksana, until now, despite best efforts by all the banks and the Minister of Finance, we only have about 33,000 MSMEs ever supported using all the government grants, whether you call it the SRF programs, the AES programs and all that, about 12.5 billion ringgit. You cannot say that only those 30,000 plus companies are actually the ones who need those assistance. There are many more companies that need assistance, but they cannot access it purely by fact that banks or the normal DFIs are actually using pre-pandemic approach.
Yes.
And I think in this budget, one of the biggest hope for the MSMEs is actually for the government to come up with a very clear narrative. While the efforts are there, but I think the passing on and trickling down efforts of what's really programmed to become policy and eventually come down to the ground, that's not really happening. So the MSMEs are still facing simple things, right? So foreign worker issue. While we have a long-term plan, we must solve it today, right? So I think one good way is, I think, the 30,000 plus foreign workers which have been employed for the plantation sector. And I think many of the service sectors, I think the number is about in the north of 200,000 plus workers. You need it now. You cannot cite long-term measures to manage short-term crisis.
Definitely. Long-term measures and short-term crisis. That's right. I'm going to just quickly stop you there, and I'm going to jump to Nordin, but we are going to get back to that point. Thank you so much for that. Now, Nordin, I mean, Datuk rightly pointed out, he started with the fact that, in short, the government needs to rethink not only its narrative, but approaches to intervention. We also know that last year, as he rightly pointed out, there were 8 aid and economic stimulus packages, and I mean, no small feat. It was amounting to approximately 530 billion ringgit. And of course, our dear PM has said that if aids are stopped too early, then this will disrupt the economy. But is that really so? I mean, Dato was also talking about, yes, if there is going to be taxes, that it has to be reinstated in stages. There shouldn't be any GST next year. And we should be, in his words, keep things simple. And I like that, because if we're trying to get everybody back on their feet and going from, cash crunch to cash positive, we should be demystifying all these things, allow for ease of transaction and doing business. Nordin, I want to ask you, especially in the work that you've been doing and looking at all of these different things, we know in terms of sentiments that, people are hopeful. You're talking about a mixture of things, but I am noticing that in terms of sentiments, about 87% of the population now seem to be neutral or don't really have a say about where the budget is going to go. About 7.2% based on Bernama's research is negative, and only about 5.9% is positive. Can you perhaps weigh in on why you think the Rakyat might be having a bit of a, I don't want to call it apathy, but we're not really putting all our eggs in a basket or really hoping for something to change. What might be some of the thoughts moving forward?
Well, thanks, Nadia. I think one of the questions is, where are the eggs going and into which basket? And I think that's going to be some of the things why probably we're seeing today until about 4:15, you'll see social media start to pick up and you'll start to see an increase of positive or negative sentiment around different discussions. But I think when we talk about the recovery and we're talking about the recovery of the economy, so much of it is about confidence and having the confidence in the economy, whether it's domestic investors or foreign investors. And I think when the Prime Minister invokes the idea of Abraham Lincoln and says, for the people, by the people, he's really signaling that a lot of money will flow into that B40 highly impacted critical communities, which I think is very important, which I think that needs to be weighed and balanced together with the idea of the economic recovery needs to be championed by titans who can grow the economy fast and sustainably. And I think that is going to be the trick. So which industries are going to be those key titan industries that are going to push the economy, because you need to pay for the B40 recovery packages, and that can only be done with a growing economy. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to borrow. So that, I think, is where we've got to look at and be critical about this upcoming budget, that we ensure that money flows into the right industry sectors. The other thing I think we've got to think about is the early policy indications that PM has given us over the last couple of weeks. One area that I like is his policy around improving health and safety. And that policy has identified about 4% of GDP improvements just by getting that right. Another one was looking at the better disaster management, which impacts many of us during the rainy seasons and all that kind of stuff. So trying to stop the leakages out of the economy is just as important as putting money into the economy.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I love the fact that you said we need to look at stopping the leakages, because let's face it, there has been, I can't even say the amount of leakages that have happened, right? So we clearly need to be doing something. I want to go lock back to Dr. O. And when we were talking about titans holding up the economy, we know that there are still some industries in Malaysia. For example, the palm industry is something that we're still banking on. We're still looking at some of the minerals, some of the things that we're still doing in Malaysia that would pretty much be the backbone of the country. But moving forward to what Datuk rightly pointed out, right? There's deep tech, there's digital technology, there's DeFi, there's disruption, the way we do things. And I firmly believe that Malaysia is not being as aggressive as it should be in terms of tech and innovation. Now, what are some of the emerging industries, or for the lack of a better word, it's not really emerging, everybody's on it already, and if we don't do this now, we're going to be left behind coming out of COVID. What are your thoughts?
Well, actually, we have been doing a lot of this because, for example, Malaysia is one of the world's leading producers of computer chips. And indeed, now there's a huge demand for these computer chips. So, but then you see some of the chip makers are local, but frankly speaking, most of them are foreign direct investors. So how do we better position ourselves to attract, attract back all these foreign direct investments would be indeed a priorities. Sometimes you don't need a lot of, shall we say, expenditure items to stimulate foreign direct investments. You have to, for example, improve the ease of doing business in Malaysia, cutting down some of the red tapes, setting up more one-stop centers and so on, so that the foreign investors will be convinced that Malaysia is once again welcoming foreign direct investments. I have foreign investors friends as well as our local, shall we say, some of these tycoons or titans of industries telling me, well, it's much easier to set up their factories, their business in some of our neighboring countries. And we are not talking about some of the more advanced neighboring countries. We are talking about neighboring countries, which have been lagging
Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. That's right.
Catching up, yeah.
Definitely. Dato', I'm going to jump to you, and I want to expand on what Dr. O mentioned just now. And he did say that, I think Malaysia is still there in terms of the manufacturing hub of all of these chips. However, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Would it be enough for us to just manufacture these chips rather than also be the powerhouse, the brain powerhouse of Southeast Asia, especially in tech and development? And I know that we've got a lot. And if you're talking about what has happened in the last few years, we cannot deny the fact that there has been a steady brain drain of people that have been leaving Malaysia cross borders to create a better life for themselves. And I know that the government has had many different initiatives to kind of pull people back. But coming out of the pandemic 2022, specifically to talent development, because I think education geared for the future, like you mentioned, fintech, DeFi, innovation, disruptive technology, really the jobs of the future that may not necessarily have been the jobs that were present prior to the pandemic. What are your thoughts on these areas and how can we move forward?
So exactly right. So again, we are back to job creation. So if we talk about the export markets, like so Dr. O mentioned the whole chip making industry and all the E&E stuff that actually even I think yesterday we have revised our numbers upwards to about 19% or so. So that upward revision, including the surge in demand, including the medical like the glove companies and the medical companies which have really shot through the roof. But none of them really translates to local jobs. They don't translate to high-end jobs, the kind of jobs that we envision in our 12th Malaysia Plan. So for us to bring back that 12th Malaysia Plan vision of having high-value jobs into the country, I think 2022 budget should be a good starting point, at least a first page, to say, let's relook at our TVET programs. Let's relook at our education system. It's time that we completely reset it. And I think we should address the elephant in the room because we must agree that we have actually taken a slight decline and sometimes a very rapid fall in our education quality.
Definitely.
We must be able to benchmark it against industry standards. We must be able to benchmark it against regional standards and bring back that TVET education as mainstream so that moving forward, at least in the medium term, we can get back. While I still don't think that we can bring it back in the immediate term. That brain drain is done deal with. You can't redo it. But what we can bring back is a niche area. It says, let's look at a particular industry. So I'd like to go back to what Dr. Nordin said, Mr. Nordin said in terms of, let's look at which are the key industries that's going to really lift off now, that low-hanging fruit. What's really going to take us there in the medium term? A good reference document would be back to the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030. There are 15 key economic growth areas. And I think if we focus there, we will be able to bring back. Because what's really happening, Nadia, is sometimes, we keep coming up with policies. While they were all very good, just relook at your 15 key economic growth areas, see what's relevant in the post-pandemic areas, put some better resources behind it, better push behind it, and actually brand us. The problem is what we are unable to do is differentiate ourselves from our regional peers. If we look at FDIs, there's no more FDIs that are really coming in because Malaysia is a much better place. No, it's purely sector-based. And that sector-based differentiation is something that we are unable to do. We have become general practitioners. We are not specialists. And I think high time we get that specialization in place and says, look, Malaysia is known for this. So
I love that. I mean, you mentioned, let's go back to basics, right? And I like the fact that you mentioned it's not always about reinventing the wheel. It's almost like every few years we've got this new slogan, this new catchy thing, and then we're going to go down a completely different direction. But therefore, there was a lot of other good things that were done in the previous iteration. I mean, we're keeping things general here. In the previous iteration to things that can actually be continued. Okay, Nordin, I want to ask you something that we're both very passionate about when we're talking about plans, right? You've got 12 Malaysia Plan, 2030 Mission, Sustainable Development Goal, leave no one behind. There's like so many of these high, lofty aspirations, right? But when we're talking about this, and I'm thinking back again about the relationship that Malaysia has. And we've got a basket full of free trade agreements that we can really now push and fully utilize coming out of the pandemic. And of course, the recent Suez Canal issue also sent a shockwave in global supply chains. There's so many different things that we can do better. I want to ask you a little bit, when people talk about what are some of the things that we can think of, especially in future-facing production base, in things coming out of the pandemic, rather than creating things all the time, what are some of the things, bringing out from what Dr. already pointed out, what are some things that we can pull out and continue?
Well, one of the things I'd like to continue on from what DATUK just said is about TVET. Now, we need to develop the key industries. And what are those key industries? They are the critical global supply chains and ensuring that we are attracting the investment into Malaysia. Why? Because Malaysia sits on the bridge of Asia, where You have one side, you've got access to the Pacific Ocean. The other side, you've got access to the Indian Ocean. And overland, rail and road, you can access most of Southeast Asia all the way up to China. So here you've got a geographic advantage that nobody else has. The other thing you've got to bring to that geographic advantage is the option that you have access to a highly valuable, highly skilled, and highly competent workforce. And it's not necessarily university graduates we're talking about here.
Yes.
Why? Because a lot of the global demand for skilled labor now doesn't come out of universities. It comes out of other types of education. So if we are able to design, and you talked about the plans, the multiple plans Malaysia has. Now we just need to continue to refine those plans in the context of what global investors want to ensure that we deliver the results. Then we will see those Malaysians who are now currently unemployed will be employed in high value jobs simply because they are solving a problem for global and also local investors. Because you've got to imagine, Malaysia does have a strong domestic industry.
And it's quite interesting, right? I was just at the SIBC forum talking about business foresight, and it was interesting where the whole industry on gaming and gamification was talking about the fact that the chances are the future of jobs, not only in Malaysia, but in the world, would probably start from someone who's 12, 13, 14, 15, who would actually be able to earn a living while playing games. I mean, this was something totally unheard of. But the last 2 years of being indoors, either everyone is a master or glued to something like Squid Game, or actually, preparing and learning new skills and tools that they never were before. I mean, even my grandmother now knows how to use the tools and the apps and e-pay, e-wallet. There's so many other functions that, whether we realize it or not, we've literally catapulted online. Now I've got 9 minutes more, and I really would be remiss if I don't ask this question, because this is an area that I think I'm very passionate about. First and foremost, we were talking about skills and industry. We were talking about high-tech, low-tech jobs, bringing dignity to the masses. But every time we have the budget, there will always be those that will fall through the cracks. So I want to end the session today talking about those that are potentially going to fall through the cracks in budget 2022, either because they don't make the critical mass in terms of number, or maybe they might not be the individuals who will return back investment to the country, those that might be seen as charity case. So I'm going to be very contentious here. We talked about gender responsive budgeting before, and then we talked about a budget that was responsive also and inclusive to persons with disability. But really, the strap pocket that we have right now, do you honestly see that this is going to be something that we're really going to do? We've been talking about health and mental health especially, but do you foresee that this is going to be something that we're going to make meaningful and effective strides on? I'm going to ask Dr. O first, and then Dato, and then let's end with Nordin. Dr. O, over to you.
Well, there are actually a lot of grassroots efforts which are trying to address this issue of people falling through the cracks and so on, so that they could, as you said, restore their dignity and perhaps means of livelihood. Even in Sabah, where I came from, there are people on the ground setting up these social enterprises, so that these are residents in remote communities, people with disabilities, so-called OKUs, and frankly speaking, even undocumented migrants, they could all find jobs. For example, and it's very flexible jobs, making use of some of the ingredients from their surrounding environments, or even upcycling garbage in order to make useful items, in order to make bags and various other items, which are then sold, and they have at least a semblance of an income. But all this social enterprise, perhaps the government did not quite notice them. And therefore, when it comes to all these grants and so on, typically the grants are going to, for example, SMEs, which are important. But I think some should be going to all these social enterprises, community-based social enterprises as well.
So social innovation and social enterprise. Okay, Dato, over to you.
Nadia, again, I think one of the three things that government must anchor this budget and even moving forward is, one is 3 E's: education, employment, entrepreneurship.
Lovely.
And the education, employment, entrepreneurship story must be targeted towards different groups. So I think we did, in the beginning of the program, we did speak about the B40,
Yes.
B60. We're not even sure where the B is now, because the bottom is kind of a given
So
range.
it's sort of like expanded, right?
So yes, there is southward shift, right? So every group has got 10% people more in the group now, right? So the M40 has got 10% more. So what I probably think is this budget must also address the fact that for the B40, you must put meaningful jobs in their hands and provide that social safety net while keeping minimum standards of living and hoping that they'll be able to actually get some jobs. Doesn't matter whether you use the, like what Dr. O mentioned in terms of the what do you call it, social enterprises, or whether we use the gig economy story, but at least get meaningful jobs to them. But your biggest impact, your biggest multiplier will come from the M40 group.
Yeah.
That M40 group is what's going to really drive both economy, jobs, and also the income of the country. And they are the ones, if you put disposable income in their hands, you have this multiplier effect in the economy. So that consumer confidence must be restored. And I think government must do everything right. They must get the narrative right to say, look, we are back on track. We won't go back to the pre-COVID days. COVID days, we won't have this impediment of the economy.
Yeah.
We will move forward, and that consumer confidence must be restored. If that is done, 70% of our GDP is private sector run. So I think as long as private sector driven, powered by the government, I think we have a good story to tell,
Right.
at least in the first page of 2022.
Thank you. So we're talking about education, employment, entrepreneurship. Now, unfortunately, we've got 10 seconds more. Nordin, I know I can count on you to kind of like zoom this in. Do you want to add anything more, or shall I say that you concur with Dato'?
I concur with that, but two words: digitization and access to information.
Wonderful.
This is the thing.
There you have it. So of course there are high hopes. There are many things that we're looking at. We're talking about education, employment, entrepreneurship, jobs with dignity, critical pillar industries, restoring consumer confidence, digitization and innovation. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And of course, Malaysians, stay tuned for the 4 p.m. announcement from the Parliament, and hopefully we will be here for a better Malaysia in 2022. That's all from us at Bernama, and stay safe.